divers, to the inaugural episode of Nick and Dave Deep Dive the Metaverse. Today we are going to be deep diving into David Lynch's 1984 Dune.
This is a classic of science fiction that has a lot of things that we can deep dive into. There's a lot of material surrounding the actual movie itself that we've looked at, we've read, watched a lot of videos, and hopefully we'll have some interesting things to say on the topic.
We wanted to have a significant piece of pop culture ephemera to focus on for our first episode. Really give you an idea of what we're going to be trying to do with this. And Dune seemed like the appropriate movie.
Yeah, we're both fans of this, I think it's safe to say. And so we wanted to do something that we were both enthusiastic about right off the bat.
Okay, and we will not beat around the bush. We'll get right into it. But before we do, I'd like to say a little bit something about our podcast fuel for this episode. I picked up on the way over here a 6-pack of a Meridian Vanilla Stout from Ecliptic. It's a seasonal dry Irish stout, ABV of 5.2 and IBUs of a nice low 23. What do you think about it, Dave?
This is not my style of beer. I generally am not a stout guy. Sometimes I'll drink a porter or a brown. I tend to like beers that are a lot lighter in texture. I don't like what they say a chewy beer. You hear those stout enthusiasts say, I want it to be so dark I can't see through it, and I want to be able to chew on it.
Exquisite mouthfeel.
Yeah, and that's not my style. That said, as a non-connoisseur of this type of beer, it's pretty good. It's got a nice little kind of spicy style to it, that Irish stout. It's nice and dry. I don't taste the vanilla in it overly, but I've always had a high opinion of Ecliptic's offerings. I've never really had an Ecliptic beer and been like, ugh, no.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Ecliptic here in Portland, Oregon is an excellent brewery. I knew buying it that Dave was not a huge stout enthusiast. If you listen to our Zero episode, you know that I am a huge stout enthusiast. But I picked this merely because it contained a spice.
And the spice must flow.
Yeah, and the spice must flow. It seemed like in the limited selection at the shitty grocery store I stopped at, it was the spiciest beer I could find. And I actually think it's a really good example of a dry Irish stout with an adjunct flavor. That's always dangerous when you take something simple and classic like a dry Irish stout and add anything to it. Because there's a reason why we've been drinking Guinness for, I don't know, 100 plus years, however long it's been around.
Yeah, you don't need to fix this style.
Exactly.
There's no reason to try to improve on something that's already pretty much peaked.
Okay, and on that note, we'll be back with our deep dive of Dune. All right, divers, let's get ready to dive into David Lynch's 1984 sci-fi epic Dune, based on the novel by the same name by Frank Herbert. This is a galaxy-spanning space opera following our hero, young Paul Atreides, the ducal heir of the planet Caladan, as he goes from being sort of a pampered rich boy to a hardened jihadist that overthrows his father's mortal enemy and the galactic empire itself. All right, Dave, what was your background with Dune?
Well, I've read the book, and I've read many of the other books after the original Dune. It's the first novel in the series. I don't even know how many there are. I've probably read the first 6 or so, and I've read the first 3 at least 2 or 3 times. When I was in the Army, reading books was a great way to pass the time, and so I definitely read this one several times. big fan of Dune, have been for a long time. And back in the day when computers were pretty primitive and the internet wasn't really a thing, there was a real-time strategy game called Dune, where you could play as the Atreides or the Harkonnens or some other house called the Ordos or something like that.
They talk about there's a lot of other high houses.
There's a green colored house. And so it was real-time strategy, which led into things like Warcraft and StarCraft and all of that, an entire genre of video games. I played that video game at home quite a lot because it didn't require the internet. It was just standalone. And so I've always been a big fan of this series. Part of the thing that drives me to love this is because even though it's a science fiction and they do crazy space travel and all of this stuff, ultimately it's using feudal and fantasy tropes. There's an emperor, there are dukes, there are essentially nobles and monsters. There are people with special powers, which are sort of magic-like or psychic or something like that. So it really clicks with me. This is sort of thing that's like right up my alley, kind of a sci-fi fantasy, just like Star Wars is a sci-fi, but it's kind of like Space Wizards.
Yeah, so when I said, because I kind of debated that if I would call it a space opera or not, did that ring true to you? Can you put this into the space opera category like Star Wars?
The movie for sure. I'm not sure I would put the books in a similar category because there's a lot more sociological commentary. There's a lot more inner turmoil and monologue. It's not really a space opera,
right? And Herbert said that he basically considered it a work of journalism. He was speaking about the real world through the science fiction tropes.
Herbert was really saying a lot of things in his books and using the veneer of science fiction to do it.
Yeah. I had virtually no background with this property. When you mentioned that strategy game, I think I did play that at friends' houses, but I didn't have a computer of my own at that time in history. So it was just Sundays over at my buddy's house, telling him what to type into the keyboard. It was one of those games, wasn't it? Where you?
No, it was a little more graphical than that. You could click on things and have them move and have them attack, and you would have your harvesters out harvesting spice, and you'd have the little carry-all transport pick them up and take them back so they didn't get killed by sandworms.
Yeah,
it was good times.
And of course, anything that had toy tie-ins and things like that when we were kids, we saw that stuff in the store.
Oh yeah,
but I think Dune was just always the movie was a little too boring for me as a little kid.
It's very adult.
It is, and over half of it is the courtly intrigue part of the movie. It takes a long time before we're in the black vinyl riding worms in the sand, the part the kid wants to watch.
Yeah, I think I didn't really time it, but it was something like over half an hour before you get any true action in the movie, and it is really dry if you're not interested in that kind of thing, if you're not interested in politics and courtly maneuvering. So I mean, if you're a fan of something like Game of Thrones, this is right up your alley. This is very Game of Thrones-ish.
Yeah, that's become one of the things it gets compared to now. And the other one, the obvious one, previously had been Star Wars. I've seen it called Star Wars for Goths, and I've seen it called Star Wars for Grown-Ups by Denis Villeneuve, who's going to be directing the reboot or the readaptation of Dune here, coming out this year, I think.
Yeah, I'm really excited for that. I definitely am going to see it. That's got to happen. It might be fun to do a head-to-head after that.
Oh yeah.
Or maybe, I don't know, something. At least comment on it, because this 1984 version had a lot of things that were ahead of their time. But even though I'm a huge fan, I'm not going to overlook the things that I thought were crude or primitive in the movie, and some storytelling decisions that I didn't really agree with. And so I'm really, really curious about the 2020 adaptation and the all-star cast that they have.
Okay, for sure. Something else that we've talked about diving into is the whole filmography of David Lynch. So this movie ended up on an axis of two things that we want to cover, and one is David Lynch, and the other is the sci-fi classics.
Yeah,
so
it's
the one place they intersect.
This was really selected because it checked a lot of boxes for us. We both like David Lynch, we both love sci-fi, and we really wanted to start our first episode off with a strong, really good movie. And so this really kind of does that. And so our format for some of these particularly single movie or album deep dives is we're going to do basically a quick take. What's your initial thoughts on the matter? So you want to start off with that?
Sure. My quick take on the movie was I was struck immediately by what a large footprint it left on the things that followed in genre. I really didn't realize how influential Dune was until I watched Dune and kind of did the math in my head that it kind of set the bar for all of these things.
Sometimes that happens when you hear a band that you'd never heard of before, and you're like, "Whoa, I've heard this sound in a bunch of modern bands."
Yeah. So one of the first things I have in my notes is the name Bob Ringwood underlined 3 times. He was the costume designer.
Oh yeah.
Those still suits are so iconic. When you think of this movie, you think of that picture of Kyle MacLachlan standing out there in the Mexican desert with the thumper over his shoulder, and he had like a rope slung around like a bandolier.
Like the black and white rope remind me of a Beetlejuice sandworm.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, Tim Burton saw this movie. There's no doubt that Tim Burton saw this movie. And that image of him is so iconic. And I'd say those Bob Ringwood costumes basically set the standard for superhero costumes going forward, from this movie to Tim Burton's Batman, all the way up probably until the Marvel movies start and you get the Kevlar canvas Captain America suit in 2010. It was black vinyl was the only way to do a superhero costume from this movie on.
I hadn't put that together, but now that you mention it, yeah, black vinyl's everywhere in those movies post 80s into the 90s.
Yes, the Burton Batmans, going to Blade, going to the Matrix, going to the X-Men movies. Everyone is ripping off Bob Ringwood and Dune.
Awesome. So I already gave kind of my initial quick take, which is that I love those feudal fantasy tropes that really are present here because it's the future, it's fantasy, there's guns and that sort of thing. But how do they fight? With knives. I mean, that's great.
Yeah, it is all about the knife, the Chris knife that the Fremen use.
The Emperor's blade that he gives to Fade.
Yeah, it is all about knife fighting. Well, there's an anti-technology theme that runs through the movie. They get deeper into it in the extended cut, which I don't recommend. The extended cut is trash, but it does explain a little bit more why they're anti-technology.
Yeah, there's a lot to be picked up on that in the books, where you read on and it gets off of Arrakis and you learn about other alien worlds and things. But I guess the other thing that really clicked with me was I'm a Kyle MacLachlan fan. He's great. He was awesome in this movie. He's extremely good comedically in Portlandia, where he plays the mayor of Portland. I love him as Agent Dale Cooper in Twin Peaks. He's just a great actor, and I can't wait to to see anything he's in whenever it comes out.
That is another thing in my notes. It says Kyle Mack is good at acting.
Yes.
He goes on such a character journey in this movie to where he's essentially playing a 15-year-old boy at the beginning.
Yeah.
He's kind of just like tousle-haired, the little prince of his house, and everyone kind of dotes on him. I mean, roughly, but he is the star in everyone's eye. And then he's a revolutionary by the end of the movie. In just over 2 hours, he does so much character development, and most of it is done just with his facial expressions.
There's some facial expressions and then a lot of inner monologue, which we'll touch on later. The other couple things I wanted to do is, as far as a personal highlight or note before we actually get into the plot and what really worked for us. So this movie was made for $40 million in the 80s. I did a little bit of math and a little bit of Googling. That's the equivalent of $124 million today. Mm-hmm. It only made $30 million. So this was a bomb.
Was that $30 million in the States? Because I know it did better in Japan and Europe.
The figure that I saw was that it made $30 million overall, but I'm not going to stick to that. I don't have that 100%. The original consensus is that after it came out and when it was in its big kind of heyday release, it was considered a bomb. Even if it made up after the fact, that doesn't change that Hollywood reputation. And I think that that's sad. It didn't get much in the way of award nominations. It got one Oscar nomination, which was for sound, and it didn't even win. It didn't really get any major award coverage. It got some smaller things here and there. But it was sort of panned by most critics. There were some critics that really liked it. Most didn't. And then David Lynch, he actually at one point disowned the film when they recut it as the extended version. That's why it's not, the extended version is not credited to director David Lynch. It's director Alan Smithy, which is the generic Directors Guild name. So that's why we chose to focus on the actual theatrical release, because that's the David Lynch version. If he had later said, I like that extended cut, we probably would have done that.
Oh, for sure. I'm a big fan or enthusiast of director's cuts when they are director's cuts. The extended cut, just a quick background on that, was very common at that point in time to do longer cuts of the movies where you throw the kitchen sink in and stretch it out to something that could be aired over 2 nights on network television. Yeah,
it was a big TV move. They were trying to make it fit properly into some time slots.
Yeah, 2-hour blocks. So that there's an extended cut of the Richard Donner Superman or the 1976 King Kong. This was part of that model, and that's not the way. David Lynch is an auteur filmmaker. He doesn't mess around with trying to do a TV cut of something.
Yeah, so we decided that it was more important that we go with the theatrical release. So the next section that we're going to do is generically what worked for you, followed by a what didn't work, and then we'll have some final thoughts. So what worked for you?
Visually, there is just it's a total feast for the eyes. I'm especially struck by anything they filmed out in the Mexico desert. All of those images, those are the things I think of when I think of Dune. You see the Fremen up on the ridge and Paul standing in front of them, or the sandworm coming up out of the sand. It's just the visual considerations in this movie are incredible.
Yeah, that's actually one of my bullet points. It's not my first one, but the Mexican desert locations were extremely iconic and great. A little bit of behind the scenes on that was that they often would show up and the cast or the crew would have to spend multiple hours cleaning the area, combing it so that there was no trash or no debris or no anything in the sand, so it looked as pristine as it did. And then during those battle scenes, they actually were burning tires to get that smoke, and those guys were out there in the triple digit temperatures in non-breathing rubber suits, breathing tire burning smoke. Pretty gnarly.
Oh yeah, it's really intense, and it's funny because of Frank Herbert really popularizing the term ecologist, and being such an environmentally minded person. I don't know how many tire fires that they had out there in the desert, but it I think they increased global temperatures probably by a half a degree.
Yeah, for sure. So top of my list for what worked for you, we've already touched on a little bit, was the acting. I really felt like first of all, the casting in this movie was really good. There weren't any stinker casting moves. There was one that I wasn't super into and maybe another, but overall, Kyle MacLachlan, amazing. I loved Sting as Fade. The part wasn't that big in the movie, but he did great. I mean, it's a telling thing that the character is iconic despite how few lines he had, and the fact that the fight scene that they had, they barely fight. They just sort of move around each other.
Yeah.
And I also love Patrick Stewart as Gurney Halleck.
Oh, yeah.
Nothing says badass like having a machine gun and a skullet while holding a pug and charging into battle in the desert.
Yeah.
I mean, that was amazing.
I love Gurney Halleck, the troubadour warrior.
Yeah.
And it's there are a lot of these characters I had in my notes. Sting isn't given much to do but look cool.
Yeah.
There's a lot of characters that you think of when you think of this movie that don't really have that much screen time, or at least that many lines in the movie. And Fade Routha, the heir of the Baron Harkonnen, is definitely one of those people. But still, Sting has that rock star persona that he gets the most out of that time. It's safe to say you're more of a Sting enthusiast than I am.
Yeah, probably.
But when he comes out of his weird steam bath in his funny little G-string,
it's the winged codpiece.
The winged codpiece.
It's crazy.
He looks incredible. He looks so incredible that they worked a nude scene for him into the movie with no context at all, just for him to stand there and show his glistening abdominals. It's really cool.
One of the interesting things about that character is that they don't really touch on it in the movie very much, but the idea is that the Bene Gesserits were trying to create they had the breeding program. They were trying to create the Kwisatz Haderach, and Fade was supposed to be the epitome and perfect distillation of the Harkonnen genetics. And Lady Jessica's child, which was supposed to be a girl, was supposed to be the epitome and perfection of Atreides genetics. And so they were supposed to have a child together and create the Kwisatz Haderach. But of course, we know Lady Jessica defied the Bene Gesserit, had a son who he himself was the Kwisatz Haderach. And another thing they don't touch on is that is because Lady Jessica came from House Harkonnen.
Yeah, that is... I think it's there in the visuals, in the color story of the movie. I think it's there through the hair, through Lady...
She clearly matches the look.
Lady Jessica has the Harkonnen look. But... I think that is deep nerd shit, and you only know about that if you also then go into the books, because it's not there textually in the movie. It's only subtext.
Yeah, the idea that the Bene Gesserit breeding program through 90 generations or something, they got it wrong by one generation was, I mean, that's pretty good. That's not bad. They created the superhuman. They just got it slightly off.
Yeah. And so that is a thing that leads in very well to something that works a lot for me in the movie, and I would say versus the book, is that it's not as clear to us how planned things are in the movie. Paul fulfilling the messianic prophecies is much more miraculous in the movie than it is in the book, where you realize that this has all been plotted out.
Yeah, that's one of the strengths and weaknesses of this story in general. That's actually on my what didn't work, is sometimes I feel like somebody, like for example, when the emperor says, this is my plan and this is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to send legions to help the Harkonnens do this and that and this and that. He monologues like an evil villain, and then it just happens without variation. It's not really that interesting. It's a little different in the book when you're talking about things like prophecy, when the prophecies aren't extremely specific, and then you have the story of how it comes to be, where you're living and breathing in the Sieches with Paul, who has become a Fremen for all intents and purposes. So I'm looking at my list of other things that really worked, and I think you kind of touched on it when you talked about the Mexican desert. As I said, the sets and models.
Oh my God, the models are definitely on my list too.
I love that stuff.
Not to be a fetishist of retro technology, but you can't beat practical models in a computer generated environment. You can't capture that. Even a scale model feels more real than a high definition, indistinguishable to the naked eye computer generated image. You're somehow, even if you're not conscious of it, your brain sees that it's not real. It doesn't have a weight to it.
Yeah, completely. They're just not quite perfect. They're really good, but they're not quite perfect. There are some things that computers do better than the models, like some of the spacescapes looked really contrived, like when they put up the planets and stuff. They didn't really look very good. But the actual ships and then the models of the planets, those effects that they put out there and those sets, those look really good. And it's hard to deny, with regard to that retro future technology stuff, how much brass and Art Deco look there was. Like, is steampunk just Dune punk? I mean, it's crazy.
Yes. I have that in my notes too. The place that it really dawned on me, the steampunkiness of it, was what are their little shuttles called? The ornithopters?
Yeah, the ornithopter.
The inside of the ornithopter, where the walls are this quilted leather padding,
and then couture,
and they've got all these brass microphones and levers, and it is very much the inside of the quintessential steampunk airship.
Oh yeah. And
yes, again, this is another place where the footprint of Dune is so outsized. It's a Dune cinematic. It's like the Velvet Underground or the Stooges.
Yeah.
Where it's only 100 people bought raw power, but all 100 of them went out and formed bands afterwards.
Yeah.
Not that many people maybe saw Dune on its initial theatrical release, but there was a lot of artists, a lot of creative people that did see this movie and then saw it over and over again.
Yeah, some of those visual elements that were put in there really were iconic, and they kind of propelled entire aesthetics forward. And I do like how it was very retro, but still somehow alien. Like when they flew into Geedy Prime, it looked really like sinister and dark, and there was almost a little bit of like H.R. Giger style to it because he had worked on the prior Dune project that never got made.
And I was going to ask, there's a few Gigery sets, and the other one is actually on Arrakis, not like in the like quarters and throne room areas, but some of the back hallways are very Giger biomechanical, and I wondered if that was a holdover from some of the earlier iterations before David Lynch came on board.
I believe, and don't quote me on this, but I believe that when they bought the rights from the company that had the French company that had previously retained them, I believe they also got all of their concept art, which they had paid for. And so all of that concept art was available for David Lynch to use for set building. And so even if it wasn't definitely a Giger piece, it was Giger inspired because there's no way to say it wasn't. They had the art, it was there, it was awesome. You can find that online if you look for it.
Did you get a chance to watch that documentary? I don't want to butcher the poor guy's name, but Jordowski's Doom, or
I did not watch it intentionally because I felt like I would dilute my mind for this, and I wanted to be really focused around this cut of this movie.
I keep nodding at things that Dave is saying, and it's not good radio because you don't see that. Maybe in a future YouTube channel, but we're having a lot of the same observations. I think to piggyback on what you're saying about the sets, this is another way of where the movie is extremely, I think, considering what it's adapting, it's pretty short at 2 hours and 20 minutes, I think it is.
Yeah, they could have done a lot more.
But they pack in a lot of information just visually. You get an understanding of the culture of Geedy Prime and the Harkonnens versus the culture on Caladan and the Atreides. Like, the Geedy Prime is so industrial, Soviet. You look at that planet and it is just overrun with technology. It's like a completely paved over planet.
Yeah, there's no love of the wild there. There's nothing natural about the Harkonnens and their home planet.
Right. They have essentially extracted everything from the planet. And then to contrast that to Caladan, it's a blue and green, more Earth-like planet. You see their castle right on the coast with the waves crashing, and you know right away everything's made of wood in their castle, and it just looks more natural. They are they're a house that has a sort of symbiosis with the land as opposed to the exploitive Harkonnens.
Well, it really throws back to the idea that the Atreides are like a medieval noble family living in a castle on a cliff, benevolent rulers of the land, whereas the Harkonnens are twisted science fiction / horror movie villain types. And that was very clearly done on purpose. Artistically, they wanted the Atreides to seem like noble people and the Harkonnens to seem like beasts.
Yeah.
And I almost feel like they overdid it with the Harkonnen badness. I'm hoping in the 2020 Dune release that the Harkonnens will be more relatable. one particular example was the character Raban. It's called the Beast Raban, who is supposed to, in the books, he's supposed to crush Dune under his heel because he doesn't know any other way to interact with people. And then they were going to blame the bad times on Raban, and they were going to have Fade take over and become beloved of the people because he did such a great job ruling the planet. Well, as it turns out, the Beast was just a smiling idiot who was just needlessly cruel all the time. He didn't actually have any redeeming qualities, and I think that's a poor example of storytelling, and it's a poor way to paint a villain. It's much easier to hate someone like that, which makes the story one-dimensional. If you take a story and you really make a character have a couple of redeeming qualities, or at least explain away their horrible nature with something understandable. Like, I mean, they kind of did that with the Joker, right? You know, they've done it with tons of characters. We say lots of them. They didn't even bother with the Harkonnens. They're just bad guys.
And I think that is a decision that's made in order to cover as much ground as you can in a very limited amount of time. For some reason, and maybe it was the studio involvement, they're determined to get this close to 2 hours, and it is a you know, it's called an epic book for a reason. It's a very dense book.
It spans many years.
Yeah, with a lot of text in it. And something that I've always been told that it was a bad adaptation, and I actually think it does an amazing job of hitting the key points of that book and all of the major scenes, at least briefly, in not a lot of time.
They did hit almost all the high points, and I agree that they did a pretty good job being faithful. Like, there's not a whole lot of main plot elements that get ignored or get new things that get added whole cloth. But I almost feel like they took a Viking saga and they made a haiku about it. So every single word in the haiku is pulling its weight. There's no wasted anything. But ultimately, it's insufficient to capture the entire story.
Yeah. And I think maybe we're drifting a little into things that didn't work for us.
Yeah, we should go off of our lists.
Yeah, but more things that... let's act... I don't know that I'm done wringing the juice out of the sets and the costumes.
Okay. Oh, well, yeah, costumes. I have a whole other point about costumes.
So I thought both the Imperial costumes and the Atreides costumes, they seem it's very like World War I or earlier, you know, like Ottoman and Spanish,
like Polish Hussar, or like early German, like World War I Germany.
Yeah, and it's I thought that was really interesting. They all seemed very human, like an earthly.
Oh yeah.
And that's not something that they explicitly say, but this is humans basically did come in this timeline. They've come from Earth. This is thousands of years in our future after humans have gone out and more or less imposed human culture on the known universe.
Yeah, and there are aliens in the Dune world, but mostly it's humans.
Yeah,
it's just kind of a human dominated universe.
And that's interesting when you get into things like the Fremen, who are the indigenous people of Arrakis, ostensibly.
Sure.
But they are still humans from Earth that have been imported. They've just been there longer.
They've been so long left alone on Arrakis that they essentially, not to use a cliche, but they went native. They just became living off the land, you know?
Going native is a reoccurring thing in the movie. That's Dr. Kynes went native, and obviously Paul goes fully native also.
And they really gloss over that. They're like, over the next few years, he really just becomes a super awesome Fremen guy.
Yeah.
Whereas in the books, it's so awesome.
But that time jump is in the books.
There is a time jump, but there's a lot more minutia that happens between Paul and the Fremen. A lot of, like, the Fedakeen, all that whole deal. I mean, I'm glad they included them in the movie when they easily could have not. I really liked all of that. I liked all of the I liked a lot, but some of the things I didn't like were the lack of character. Like, I guess I'm getting into what didn't work for me. If I'm going to stick with those costumes and things, I did make a point about how the Imperial costumes looked very World War I military, and the Atreides uniforms before they go to Arrakis, they have bird of prey emblems. They have high collars. They're wearing black. It looks very, very German. And you already pointed out that the Harkonnens have multiple small allusions to like a Soviet style in their look and their style. And so I think that those costuming decisions were really well done. And you already touched on the still suit. The still suit was perfect.
It is, and it's one of those cases. I think it on an iconography level, it improves on the book. Whereas in the book, the still suit covers the whole head, basically. Just their face is visible. And then we would be missing out on, like...
acting?
Well, yeah, acting, but a lot of epic hair choices. Kyle MacLachlan's hair looks majestic. He's, it's like a lion
with that look.
It's like a lion's mane. And Patrick Stewart as Gurney Halleck, when they reunite and his skullet is down to shoulder level.
Oh yeah.
He looks so badass, and then he goes native in a hurry.
Oh, he wanted to.
Yeah, it's a longer process in the book, but they do that quick. Like he's like, all right, I'm a Fremen now.
Yeah. And I mean, that's kind of Gurney's character, though. He's like an old dog mercenary guy who,
But in the books, they wear sort of Bedouin robes over the still suits, and that would really then it just would be Lawrence of Arabia. The sci-fi-ness of it would kind of get lost if they were wearing the robes.
Well, they wouldn't even need to wear the still suit costumes because it would all be covered. And that's not the point. And I understand the idea of how you cover the head and when you're in the deep desert, you cover the mouth and everything has the mask. So really only your eyes are showing. That makes a lot of sense from a sci-fi writer's perspective, but from a filmmaker's perspective, it makes no sense to hide the face of your actors.
Oh, for sure. I mean, that's something that comic book movies have spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to overcome the mask.
Sure.
That's what gave us the now iconic Robert Downey Jr. heads up display on his face. Because otherwise you would never see your star actor in those movies because he wears a full on face mask.
Yeah, that's very true. So another thing that stuck out to me of what works for me is there's a scene fairly early in the movie where Paul is visited by Gurney and the rest of them, and him and Gurney have that fight. And I love Patrick Stewart, being a Star Trek fan, and I really liked how they used a very small amount of time in the movie, and they effectively demonstrated a lot of things. Tech level, how the tech works. They demonstrated the relationship between all of these people, the Doctor, the Mentat, and Gurney, who I guess he would be the bodyguard.
And sort of. He's like he's like the sergeant at arms or something like that. He occupies a role like that.
That particular scene was extremely important to me. I think having Paul be strong enough to sort of win that fight, but then show that Gurney is cunning enough to have at least made it a Pyrrhic victory. It really kind of paints those characters really well, and it gives you a lot of insight into a lot of aspects of Dune.
Yeah, that worked for me really well. It's one of the weird visuals, but they're shields that they wear. I was just sort of struck at how I've not ever seen that copied again.
No.
This sort of geometric force field thing that you can pass things through if they're moving slowly, but will deflect a blade. Like, it's a very unique concept, and it has stayed unique. It's one of the things that hasn't gotten copied, and I think it looks better than it has any right to.
Yeah, it actually looks really good. That was one of the things that obviously you can't make a model of that sort of thing, and it just looked awesome. It was an early special effects choice, and I think they did a great job with it.
Yeah, I've got to imagine that was actually like hand animated on top of those cells, probably. Probably someone is painting that onto the film strip.
Interesting, with semi transparent paint.
Yeah, and doing it frame by frame. It seems, they don't use it a lot in the movie. It's kind of that scene and the one where we lose Duncan Idaho a little bit later are the only times you see those suits. But I think that was probably a pretty painstaking effect, and it works a lot better than you would expect it to.
Yeah, totally. I really liked it. Oh, spoilers if you really like Duncan Idaho, who had way too small of a part in the movie. Duncan Idaho has a lot of stuff in the books, and even later books. There's more Duncan Idaho. And so that character is really deep and really cool that you don't get much of in the movie. Did you have anything else on your list that worked for you?
Of things that worked for me, we touched on the costumes, and I think we can get into the things that don't work, and then there'll be a lot of minutia.
I've got one or two more. One important one that really worked for me before we jump into what didn't work, because maybe this is a hybrid, because there's a little bit that didn't work, but mostly I liked it. First of all, I loved the Spacing Guild, how they were represented. I thought that how they had the navigators represented in those giant tanks of spice dust or spice fog was really, really cool. I also thought the actor who played the main servitor, who was speaking through the translation device, that guy did a really great job just with his expressions. Basically, he walked in and just trash talked the Emperor every time he talked to him.
And that voice, I didn't look this up, but I thought of it at the time. That's the voice of the same voice they used for one of Jabba the Hutt's droids, isn't it? The voice of that guy. Did that sound familiar to you?
I don't know. Honestly, I don't have that one.
Yeah, that I immediately thought of the droid that's in charge of the droids at Jabba's palace had that same voice. And the movies came out the same year, I think, and
very similar vibe.
Yeah, there's voiceover actors is a pretty small community, and I think that's the same guy.
Probably is. Now, I really liked how the actual navigator looked really horrific and necro.
Yeah.
It's hard to believe that thing ever evolved from a human.
Yeah.
Pretty gnarly. I think that was a good choice. But I'm not sure I loved the choice of how the servitors were dressed.
Oh, and you don't like the repurposed body bags?
Yeah, they looked like they were wearing trash bags with fetish gear.
I don't think that is entirely far off from the truth. So I think you streamed this online, correct? On Amazon.
I just paid to rent it.
Yeah,
digitally.
so I bought the Blu-ray, so I got a little more behind the scenes stuff there, and so those costumes, and I think also a lot of the Harkonnen troops, and I'm blanking on what the Imperial soldiers are called.
The Sardaukar.
Yeah, the Sardaukar. Yeah, those costumes were actually made out of body bags.
Man, those Sardaukar costumes where they have like the square screen thing in the front for the visor and all of that, they look like hazmat suits.
Yeah, they're like reverse hazmat suits.
Yeah.
The hazardous material is inside the suit, because when Duncan Idaho stabs one through the face mask and the gas escapes. So it's like they're hazmat suits that hold in the hazardous material instead of keep it out.
I did not like those costumes. I mean, for the exact same reason I didn't like the Spacing Guild servitor costumes. I just thought that they weren't up to standard. The still suits were so good. The formal dress was really good. They even had good soldier gear on the Atreides soldiers, like desert warfare stuff. That was all cool. What's with these body bags?
And I mean, and just I don't know if it was just for setting the mood, but they were used body bags. I think we should be specific about this.
Oh, were they?
Yeah, they had to like hose them out and disinfect them before they started cutting costumes out of them, and they did not tell the cast that they were wearing used body bags.
Okay, that's darkness,
isn't it? Like that is, and I'm surprised we haven't said it more, but that's Lynchian. That's the Spacing Guild, though, the Navigators. That is Lynchian. We're only 3 movies into the David Lynch filmography at this point, and this body horror mutation, off kilter, off putting vibe is happening again in his movies. I think the Spacing Guild Navigator is not that far removed from John Merrick, the Elephant Man, from the previous movie, and from the baby in Eraserhead. There's already a reoccurring theme of these sort of mutant fetal. I don't know what to call it. Body horror is something I wrote in my notes over and over again.
He really likes this, like, really kind of gross out style, but still, I think it was important that the Navigator was extremely alien. And I guess another point on the Spacing Guild was those ships were not cool looking.
Just the big tubular
the tubes, yeah. And then like it was a giant like soda can that had a like a super ornate like filigreed gate for ships to fly in. It was like needlessly gaudy on the gate, but the actual ship itself is just utilitarian and non-interesting.
That's interesting. I mean, that I didn't have a problem with that, honestly. I think it's consistent with the way the guild is characterized. Like basically, the guild transports people from all different houses, and it's an anonymous thing. When a guild ship is punching through space from one point to another, it might have Harkonnen ships and Atreides ships loaded on it, and they're not supposed to know that the other person is there, and everyone has safe conduct when they're in those ships.
Yeah, it's supposed to be kind of that everyone is so afraid of messing with the Spacing Guild because they don't want to be stranded. Right. That everyone plays good.
Right. And so to me, just the idea that those ships, it is completely utilitarian. It's just about getting as many smaller ships inside of it as possible. Just a great big tube, kind of for whatever reason, does work for me. That didn't bother me at all. it's a I often guessed wrong at what are the David Lynch inventions and what is actually in the book. Because the Space and Guild, they talk more about them in the book. You never get these things where you actually see what a navigator looks like. No one really knows what they look like. So that's him freestyling a little bit.
For sure. The navigators are supposed to be extremely mysterious and extremely psychically powerful, and that Bene Gesserit, Reverend Mothers, don't want to mess with that kind of power. It's supposed to be like their unseen powers that can predict the future and all kinds of crazy things.
Yeah. And I like that was an interesting thing, again, where the movie just barely touches it, that because the navigators control basically all interstellar travel, but you do want to do some things on the DL, smugglers have to be tolerated because there has to be another way to move people besides the proper channel. So this idea that even though smugglers don't pay taxes and things like that all of the houses sort of tolerate them, because if you want to do an assassination or something, you need the smugglers to be able to move you through back channels. Yeah,
for sure. There's a lot of really interesting layers that could be done in this game, in this world, if it were a game. Like a lot of things, I always think of things from a game perspective. I think that the 2020 Dune movie might spawn a license for a gaming setting. They often do when something pop culture comes out.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me.
So the next thing, I guess the number one thing I have on my what didn't work list is the opening narration by Princess Irulan. It seemed really blunt. It was boring. It was just focused on her face. There's a narrative concept when you're writing a book or whatever that is show, don't tell. They literally didn't show at all. They just told. It was very, very blunt and no nuance to it. They could have done a short scene to show a lot of these things, or they could have. I even like the pre-roll on Star Wars better for setting the scene. This was clearly their version of the pre-roll, but I think if you're gonna have a visual at all, you should do more with it than just have the princess telling you
her face. So this is a lot of things. My initial take on them versus after I dove a little bit deeper in, things migrated a little bit. And I would have agreed with you on my first viewing. I thought the Princess Irulan intro was weird. Then I got into the book, and that is sort of like the interludes all throughout the book are Princess Irulan reading from like the sayings of Muad'Dib and all of that stuff.
Yeah, in the metaverse of Dune, Princess Irulan writes a book about Muad'Dib, and so all of the interludes are her passages about him.
So my opinion on it changed after reading the book, and after seeing some interviews with Frank Herbert, because he said the movie starts like the book starts, and he was happy with that. It's true to his vision.
Sure.
And so I think it is a weird storytelling choice. Like you said, I'm a big fan of show don't tell, and Dune is a show and tell movie.
Oh, it's hella tell.
That would be the biggest thing that doesn't work for me, although I don't know what the alternative is the whispered voiceover.
Oh, man.
It is all through the movie. You are present in their thoughts. And it is just so odd.
It's funny, like after the little like hunter killer droid thing, whatever it's called, comes out of the wall. Is gonna kill Paul, and he's thinking, and then the door opens, and it's like, who is this small lady? Like, why did you have to have that in there? I mean, he didn't actually say who is this small lady.
Yeah.
But you get what I mean. Like, they had throwaway lines. Like, you could have deleted half of the lines. Some of the things, I actually kind of did I wouldn't say a lot of thinking, but a fair bit about the voiceover, because sometimes it works great. Like the Gamja bar scene. Mm-hmm. So good. And it's Paul's inner monologue and then the Reverend Mother's inner monologue.
I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer.
Yeah.
I don't know. This has to do with my poor note taking, but before we get too far from the things that don't, or things that did work and into the things that don't work.
Sure.
I do want to say a little bit about all of the sort of sayings and mantras that get repeated.
Oh, sure.
Fear is the mind killer. By my will alone, I set my mind in motion.
That was fresh for the movie. That wasn't in the books.
Yeah. So, and I think David Lynch did a really good job where he added things. They are flavor consistent with the book. He was an enthusiast of the book, and he did a really good job of writing in Herbert's voice.
Yeah, and there were a lot of things that were said, like a lot of dialogue options, like things that Stilgar would say that were very much from the book. But if you were purely a movie goer, there's no way that you could have got that. Like he was referencing something that was pretty deep nerd. It was, I don't know if in the 80s, if they would, while I was alive in the 80s, I wasn't doing anything like with media or pop culture. I wonder if people commonly read the book before they would see a movie, or if movie adaptations of books were like a huge thing. Because it's big now.
Yeah. So my recollection of Dune was, I knew not a lot, but in my weird nerd circle, it was very common to be fanatically devoted to the Dune books and shit on this movie.
That was some nerds like that.
Yeah, that was my not personally informed opinion that I kind of went in this with, that this is a bad adaptation of a good book. And I don't feel that way after watching it, but that was the impression that I had picked up from my friends.
Yeah, I had a lot of friends that had a similar vibe, but that's the easy take anytime there's a book to movie, because the book always has, many times more detail than the movie. And so it's easy to always say bad adaptation, no good. But I actually think this was a fairly good adaptation, just like you already said. So getting into the next thing that I didn't like was more with the show don't tell, particularly when the Emperor monologued his nefarious plot, and then later on when Baron Harkonnen monologued his nefarious plot. It was so it kind of goes along with the whole Princess Irulan intro. It's just not subtle. It's just not creative. It's weak storytelling, and I think they could have done more with it. Like, you can reveal what the plan is without having a supervillain monologue. Like, sometimes I swear Baron Harkonnen needed a mustache to twirl.
Yeah, that's I'm definitely on board with that. Baron Harkonnen, to compare, he's so much more grotesque in the movie with the pustules.
Yeah. And
all of that stuff is kind of turned up to 11, and he becomes so cartoonish and over the top.
Yeah.
Whereas in the book, he's portrayed as being grotesquely fat, and needing kind of repulsors to get around because he can't support his weight. But
back to the Wall-E comment, right?
Yeah, but like in Wall-E, but he does not fly around the room bathing in young boy blood and all of this stuff, and he's not like kind of disease infested. He's much more sinister and intimidating in the book.
He is very, very intelligent in the books.
Yeah.
He's portrayed. There's a reason why they want to combine the Harkonnen lines with the Atreides lines. It's because they both have things to bring to the table. And the Harkonnens are supposed to be kind of like your quintessential Slytherins, right? They're really cunning and they're ruthless and they're extremely driven. But I think they turned it up to 11. And one thing I didn't like, and I don't know if it was a product of the time, was that I feel like Baron Harkonnen was portrayed as being, I don't know if they were saying he was homosexual or if he was queer, and they made that part of his evilness. And I don't like that because I don't see those things as related.
Yes, that's in my notes too. Queer coding of Baron Vladimir Harkonnen. So this is a common trope in fiction to queer code the villains, especially in like Disney movies. If you think about it, like Ursula and Jafar and Scar the lion, like they're all sort of queer, like subtextually queer. No one's sexual at all in Disney movies.
They're not conforming to a standard gendered role that you would assume. So
exactly,
and I think they're a little off.
Yeah, and it has to do with like the meaning of that word queer. It's just part of how they make the villain alien, and it is something like culturally that we're only just barely getting out of doing.
I think we're just recognizing that it's being done at this point pretty much. And that's why I think as a person living in 2020 and watching a movie from 1984, which was a long time ago, it was not extremely overt. He was clearly very evil, and he was also clearly gay or bisexual or queer of some kind.
Yeah, and so that's another thing. I don't want to equate being like a pedophile with being queer.
Exactly.
But he's interested in young boys. And that's much more explicit in the book than it is in the movie. But you do see that in the movie. They bring in that boy, and he's all over him and like pulls his heart plug out, and it's just really.
It wasn't clear to me how old they were trying to portray that person to be, because I mean, just looking at them, I thought that they were a late teenager, but I think they might have been portraying like a young teen. I don't know. It doesn't really matter. The fact is that that whole deal, it's like, oh, let's make him more evil. Let's add this other layer of otherness that I think is pretty not additive to the story.
It doesn't age well.
Yeah, it's definitely not a modern look, and it's not something I appreciated in the movie. I was pretty sure that you also would pick up on that. Just knowing you. Here's one thing that was really super bad. The green screen moments. Oh my god.
Are you referring like specifically when they're all up riding the worms?
That's one of them. That was so bad when they're on there and you're like, it doesn't even look sort of like they're in the desert.
Yeah.
It looks like there's B-roll of the desert running behind some guys.
It's sort of shocking because there's so many moments where the effects have held up well, that those places where it doesn't, it puts me in mind of something from a few years earlier, Flash Gordon.
Yeah.
Which I think Flash Gordon kind of leaned into the camp more than Dune is trying to do. But like if you were going to compare Dune with Return of the Jedi, which would be like the comparable thing that it's up against,
sure,
the effects do not hold up as well in Dune compared to Return of the Jedi, and I think they have comparable budgets.
Well, one of the things I saw, because I watched several YouTube videos where there were like reviews and behind the scenes and lots of interviews with people, and one of the things that was said about this movie and the effects team is that a lot of the people on this effects team were relatively new to the movie industry. They were not, this was not a veteran effects team, and they did an amazingly good job considering their level of experience and considering the fact that they're being compared to things like Star Wars, which was a huge, industrial light and magic and all of that. It was kind of like the big deal. So I thought that was, they did a pretty good job in some things, but holy crap, those green screens were so bad. And it went also to when you see like the planet Giedi Prime hanging in space. It's like it looked like a middle school play where they lower a Giedi Prime on a string over a blue background.
Yeah, so you've mentioned that that thing a couple of times now, and I think I have a slightly different take on it. I think that it's supposed to be an image from like the what do they call them, film reels or film books. They have a sci-fi name for their information files that they observe.
Yeah, they have like a internet.
And I feel like that is supposed to be like the Encyclopedia Britannica picture of Giedi Prime. I don't think it's supposed to be an actual picture of it, because like when Paul he's kind of studying up on Arrakis before he goes, he's being the little bookworm.
Yeah, he's a nerd boy.
He's looking at images like that in his view screen, and so I took it to be an in-world image rather than an image of the world. If that's an awkward way to phrase it.
It's meta. He's looking at a picture of it in a movie.
Yes, exactly.
So I get that maybe,
but you're right of all of the things, the sandworm writing looks really bad. Well, because the sandworms don't have a lot of details except in the mouth.
Sure.
So the looking at the back of the worm is not interesting. And the compositing is not done well, so they definitely look like they're floating in front of the environment that they're supposed to be in.
Yeah, for sure.
And they're all just a little too keen up there. Like they're kind of like smiling and high-fiving, and
no one's afraid at all.
Yeah, and it's a very weird vibe. But when the Toto score comes in at that moment, I go along with it. I don't know why. Like I'm sort of, I guess, back because I think the compositing makes me think of Flash Gordon. It's like when the Hawkmen show up in Flash Gordon.
Oh, man.
The compositing is very much on that same level. They're floating in front of that screen, and they are definitely not in the environment. But when he says, "To me, my Hawkmen," ha ha ha, and they fly in, I'm into it.
Well, it's funny that you say when that Toto score comes in, you're like, yeah, like it's like a fist pumping moment, because for me, when the Toto score came in, I looked over and I said, oh, now there's rock and roll guitar. I guess it's serious time now.
Yeah.
I literally said that deadpan watching the movie. And so I was just like, oh man.
Don't get me wrong. It's a weird score. Toto is a weird choice. David Lynch is a weird director, and this is a weird movie. Yeah. And so, yeah, you don't have John Williams do the epic score like every other movie of the era. You have Toto do it,
Did they do the whole thing?
The whole thing. There's one Brian Eno song, and the rest is all Toto.
I did not know that. And I actually that was on my list of what worked for me, is I liked the soundtrack and score of this movie. Mm-hmm. I thought it was pretty good.
Just not that song.
That moment when they bring in the distorted electric, I'm like, oh man, just kill me at this point. Like that was not cool to me.
It's very cheesy.
Yeah, it had to have been intentional. He's not an idiot. Okay, next thing on the list of things that did not work, and I hate to say this, but the casting decision, Alia, played by the little girl Alicia Witt. I did not like that acting. I mean, what are you going to ask for from a 4-year-old?
It's not her voice, though, right?
That's what kills me, actually, because the little girl sitting there and like putting up her finger and being creepy, whatever, that's fine. But the voiceover, oh my God. It's like if you told like a middle-aged lady that she needed to try to do a 3-year-old's voice, but the 3-year-old has the mind of a grandmother. Now do it. And it's like, oh, what would that sound like? Well, it sounds horrible. That's what it sounds like.
But she, that is a shorthand way of saying she was born with the mind of a Reverend Mother.
Yeah.
And so she does talk like an old lady. It's supposed to be off-putting. They talk about how off-putting it is in the book.
Yeah, she weirds everyone out in the book, and that would have been great if I was weirded out by it, but I wasn't.
You're just annoyed.
I just thought it was lame.
I actually do. I'm pro Alicia Witt's performance.
Sure,
I can get on board with you though about the voiceover. I would have rather. It would have been creepier having a little girl speak in adult language than having an adult voice come out of the little girl.
Yeah, that would have been much better. Like if they could actually get the little girl to say the things, like just parrot back these lines. Yeah. That would have been a lot creepier. The voiceover of an adult voice doing a little girl's voice, no, that was just bad. So I guess my criticism isn't with Alicia Witt, it's with the voiceover choices that they made. Did you have more to say on that one?
Yeah, I was just going to kind of point out. So this is Alicia Witt is one of the frequent David Lynch collaborators.
Sure, like Kyle MacLachlan.
Like Kyle MacLachlan. So this is the first time Kyle MacLachlan, Alicia Witt, and Everett McGill, who played Stilgar, the first time that they...
And Stilgar's... all those people are in Twin Peaks.
Exactly. I would say all these people come back for David Lynch over and over and over again.
Interesting thing about that. I saw a recent thing on my Google News feed where they asked Kyle MacLachlan if he was interested in doing a cameo in the 2020 Dune.
Oh, yeah?
And he said, no, not really. But then they asked him if he was really interested in doing... more Twin Peaks, and he was like, absolutely, I'll do anything with David Lynch.
Yeah, they have a unique relationship.
Yeah.
And so it's that is interesting, and it's too bad if he won't do a cameo in
I don't think he was saying no. They were saying like, what if you were offered, would you do it? I think he was kind of on the
what's the point?
Yeah, it's kind of like, it's a new world. So that I only really have like one more thing that I didn't like on my what didn't work, and it was the Water of Life acid trips, like when Paul does it and when Jessica does it. I just felt like they seemed super dated. It seems like that psychedelic filmmaking where they try to take you on a ride.
Yeah.
And it just didn't work for me. Right. Like there's like outlines of hands and things floating around.
He becomes the hand of God. Like all the symbols mean something. But I did write in my notes, very film school.
Yeah.
It's very, this is an art house film moment. Whenever Paul has a prophetic vision, and the Water of Life one is kind of the biggie. It's the one where they're making up for a lot of stuff that they don't have time to do in the movie and trying to get to the climax.
Yeah, for sure.
So it is sort of the most heavy-handed one, but I just sort of take those as Lynchian moments, and they didn't really bump me out of the film.
Okay. And what are your final thoughts?
So, final thoughts on Dune. It's something that we haven't talked about a lot yet, that I don't want to leave this without talking about, is how much Star Wars took from Dune. Not necessarily the movie, because the movie's coming out just as the final film of the original trilogy is. But so much stuff from the Star Wars setting, essentially the planet Tatooine and then Jakku, are very Erikian in style, and they talk about Obi-Wan living on the other side of the Dune Sea, and they talk about spice mining, and smugglers play a big role in Star Wars, and smugglers play a big role in Dune, and it's a short walk from the Bene Gesserit to the Jedi Knights.
I can see that.
And some of the powers are the voice is very much the Jedi mind trick, where you can take over other people's mind, and it's just George Lucas took a lot of his best ideas from these books.
Well, he's a pretty big borrower.
Oh yeah,
and Star Wars is kind of a rehash of the monomyth with a samurai movie and a spaghetti western.
Yeah, little western, little space opera, little Flash Gordon, little Dune.
Yeah.
He's
a melting pot.
He's there's a few filmmakers like Tarantino's like that too, where they're remixers.
Yeah, for sure. So go. Do you want to give it a rating? Do you want to wrap it up and give it your stars?
Give it my star rating?
Yeah.
It's going to be difficult because I think my affection for the movie outpaces its quality.
I'm right there with you.
This is probably a generous 3.5 star movie, and I'm really stretching because I think there's certain things that are super impressive about it.
Sure.
But I think because of those show don't tell moments and some of the awkward compositing and things, I just can't go any higher than that, and it really probably doesn't deserve it.
All right. Well, my final thoughts are basically I really enjoyed this movie. I love the books. I love the IP. Some of the effects look really dated, but overall, a lot of it stands up. The acting is great. I wrote here, I feel like there were moments of greatness, and then there were moments I wanted to pass more quickly. So I feel on my notes I gave it a 3 3/4, but I think you're right. I have a lot of nostalgia for it. I think a 3.5 is right where it should be, and that's with a generous dose of love.
All right. Well, I think that's a wrap on Dune. All right, welcome back. What was 15 seconds for you, hopefully, actually ended up being closer to a month for us. We had some technical difficulties and some delays, and then we came down with some sort of plague.
Yeah, Nick gave it to us all, pretty much.
I don't think that's true. I think for me to be the patient zero, I don't think you had a proper incubation time to display symptoms that quickly.
See, he says that, but I went and I looked at the calendar, and I actually hung out with him a week before the time when we were accusing him of getting us sick.
Oh, okay. That actually does, that math checks out.
Because we got sick the day after we hung out for his wife's birthday, but we also hung out literally 1 week before that too.
So I may or may not have been the outbreak monkey, but we don't think it was the coronavirus. But
no, nobody had all the symptoms, and no one got really sick. Just kind of a flu thing.
But anyways, what it did do is give us an opportunity to listen to the episode. And while we're not going to re deep dive Dune, I do feel we did a disservice by not mentioning Sean Young's Cheney at all. Somehow we managed to give less words to her than David Lynch did, which was not many.
Yeah, it's super sad. One of my things that I lament, or I guess I would call it a criticism of the movie, is that it doesn't spend much time with Paul in the Sieches, which are the Fremen holdfasts, where he kind of learns to be a Fremen, where he becomes Usul.
Yeah.
And so basically that's where Cheney develops her character completely in the books, and then in the movie it's glossed over with a narrative, more of that inner monologue stuff where Paul is like, oh yeah, and then we fell in love and I became a Fremen.
Yeah, we get a very accelerated version of that. And so anyways, that's why she didn't get mentioned in our notes earlier, but I thought we should bring it up now.
Yeah, she was really good.
So that's a second wrap on Dune, and brings us into our final segment, which is where I ask Dave, what are you into right now?
Well, right now I'm into a particular YouTube channel. It's by the Swedish guitarist Ola Englund. He's a really good, cool guy. He plays guitar very well. He's in several bands you might have heard of, or maybe not. Underground kind of Swedish death metal stuff, The Haunted, Feared. He used to be in 6 Feet Under, which is an American death metal band. But his YouTube channel is not just for guitar players. A lot of his content is applicable to anybody who's interested in heavy metal or just sort of goofy metalhead shenanigans, I guess. Although some of his videos are pretty gear oriented, like he talks about guitars, he talks about amps, tones, patches, recording tips. But some of the other segments that he does are really interesting for literally anyone. He does a weekly FAQ where people comment on his previous YouTube video and ask him questions, and oftentimes they're just random about literally anything. Sometimes they ask his wife questions and she comes on and she'll answer them every now and then. And she's a pretty good humored lady, considering she married like a goofy Swedish heavy metal guy. He's kind of like a little Toki-ish, like Toki Wartooth.
Yeah.
Kind of like that, like a goofy blonde haired funny guy who's really good at playing guitar. And since I like to think of myself as a heavy metal guitar player who enjoys some humor, his YouTube channel appeals to me. A couple other segments that I think are worth mentioning is he has one called Coffee with Ola, which I think anybody who's interested in music might like. He has coffee with musicians, and they just talk about that musician's journey. Most recently, he did Devin Townsend, which you might know from Strapping Young Lad or Devin Townsend Project, etc. He's kind of a virtuoso, amazing musician. He sat down for an hour and just talked with Devin, and Devin is a really chill, like real guy. He lives in Vancouver, BC, and he just talked about his life and all this stuff.
Has Devin Townsend shaved his head all the way yet? Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that happened several years back, but he was most notable for the skullet.
Yeah, like I just remember that bald head with the odd dreadlock here and there. It was a rough picture, but great musician.
Yeah, and he's really cool, really chill. And the other thing about Ola that is worth mentioning if you're going to talk about him is he started his own guitar company where he designed guitars that metalheads would want to use. And so they have premium features that metalheads value, things like stainless steel frets, high quality wood fretboards, so you get the nice crisp tone. We're not blues players. We're not looking for that rich, creamy sound, so we need the sharp attack. He uses things like Evertune bridges, which are a modern invention, but it's a non-electric way, not like those Gibson robotic tuners, which are hot garbage. I have an Evertune bridge on one of my guitars. It's really, really great. I've really considered buying one of these. I've actually linked Nick pictures of him asking, which one do you like? Which do you think is cool?
Guitars, yeah.
Yeah. One's kind of the Explorer style, which is kind of the pointy-ish James Hetfield thing. Mm-hmm. And then the other one is kind of a Les Paul shape. It's called a single cut. And I like both of them a lot. I've really been thinking about it because I'm a 6-string player, but in Barrowlands we've been talking about incorporating in some 7-string stuff into the next album cycle. And Jay, our other guitar player, he bought a really nice Caparison 7-string, and so I've been wanting to get a 7-string myself. It's like when one of your buddies, like when you're a kid, gets a brand new bike, you really want a new bike. Yeah.
I like that Les Paul style. I thought that was really classic looking, but the Explorer has a charm of its own too. So
yeah, I have my first nice guitar that I ever bought for myself was after I got back from the Middle East back in the early 2000s. I bought myself a actual Les Paul, like a nice USA Gibson Les Paul, one of the limited edition Gothic series. And it's a super nice guitar. It's been my workhorse forever. So I have a fondness for that Les Paul body shape, but I almost feel like if I'm going to buy a Les Paul shaped guitar, I should just buy a Les Paul Custom, which is kind of like the king of Les Pauls.
Right.
It's a little more expensive, but I'm a big boy now. I'll take care of it. I'll have it for the rest of my life. Anyway, so I guess that's what I'm into. Ola England. It's England with a U, not an A, not England. If you want to check him out on YouTube, he's one of the most popular guitar/metal YouTubers in the world. So definitely check it out. And so how about you? What are you into right now?
So the other day I saw a notification. I had a direct message on Instagram from the band Calabrese. And I figured, this is going to be just a formulaic, generic message that was sent out,
Like
but
a
actually
bot or something.
Yeah, but I actually had a personal video message from Davey Calabrese, the drummer from the band Calabrese, just thanking me for being a fan of the band, which I thought was kind of tremendous fan outreach to go through their friends list and shout everybody out. So I want to give a heads up about their most recent album, which is called Flee the Light. They've been, if you're familiar with their earlier stuff, they start out as a very horror punk band, very steeped in the Misfits and the AFI of that time, that Art of Drowning era AFI. But they've really matured quite a bit and incorporated more of like a dark wave and death rock sound. And I think if you're a fan of the Misfits and Danzig like we are, you definitely should check out Calabrese and their most recent album, Flee the Light. I have not listened to that most recent album, but on your recommendation, I've listened to those earlier albums and those mid-period albums, and I definitely agree that if you like Danzig, if you like the Misfits, if you like AFI, Calabrese is really good. Yeah, I mean, my favorite is still kind of the middle period of Calabrese. Dayglow Necros is my favorite album. But I'm never gonna wag my finger at a band for maturing and becoming more rounded songwriters.
Well, at this point on our Instagram, we have very few actual followers, so Nick is going to go in and send each of you a message because he's just kidding. But that would be pretty cool. Since we haven't published any podcasts yet, we're getting a little episode bank before we do it, but we still have some followers, so that's really cool.
Yeah. Maybe in the next episode, I'll shout some people out. I've got some, there's some people that liked us when there was really nothing to like about us yet.
Just saying, hey, we're a podcast, we exist.
Yeah, and so I'd like to shout some of those people out, and some of our friends that have followed us that have social media profiles that they like to share. But I think actually we should probably just wrap up this episode.
Sounds good to me.
So you want to give us a call to action?
Well, please subscribe to us on your favorite podcatcher and rate us generously. A 5-star review costs you nothing but means everything to us.
You can find us across social media all around the metaverse as Deep Dive the Meta. Dave likes Twitter. I prefer Instagram, but we're also on Pinterest, which nobody seems to like.
True. Well, I guess this is really goodbye.
Don't say goodbye. Say good journey.